I was drinking my morning coffee when I heard the unmistakable rumble of a truck backing into my driveway, and what I saw through my kitchen window made my blood pressure spike faster than any caffeine ever could. A massive pile of grass clippings, yard waste, and what appeared to be debris from landscaping work was being dumped right in front of my garage by a truck bearing the Meadowbrook Springs HOA logo on its side. I lived in Phoenix, Arizona, in a neighborhood called Desert View Estates, which bordered the affluent gated community of Meadowbrook Springs. My house sat on a corner lot that technically wasn't part of their HOA, something I'd verified 3 times with my real estate agent before purchasing the property 2 years ago. The HOA next door had a reputation for being strict, but I figured that as long as I wasn't under their jurisdiction, I'd be fine. Apparently, I was wrong. I rushed outside, still in my pajama pants and t-shirt, watching as 2 workers finished emptying what must have been several lawns worth of grass clippings onto my pristine concrete driveway. The pile was enormous, at least 6 feet high and spreading across the entire width of my driveway, completely blocking access to my garage where my car was parked. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" I shouted, jogging toward them. The driver, a younger guy who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, held up his hands defensively. "We're just following orders, man. The HOA manager told us to dump it here. This is my private property. You can't just dump your trash on someone's driveway." The second worker, an older man with sun-weathered skin, shrugged apologetically. "Take it up with the HOA office. We just do what we're told." They said the regular disposal site is full and they needed a temporary dumping spot. A temporary dumping spot. This is my home, but they were already climbing back into their truck. The engine roared to life, and they pulled away, leaving me standing there in the Arizona morning heat, staring at a mountain of rotting grass that was already starting to smell in the 90-degree temperature. It wasn't even 8 in the morning yet, and my day was already ruined. I pulled out my phone and took dozens of photos from every angle, documenting the pile, the scattered clippings that had spilled across my driveway, and the tire marks from their truck. Then I called the Meadowbrook Springs HOA office, my hands shaking with anger as I dialed. "Meadowbrook Springs HOA, this is Brenda speaking. How may I help you?" The voice on the other end was cheerful, completely oblivious to the fury about to come her way. "This is Marcus Chen from Desert View Estates. Your landscaping crew just dumped an enormous pile of grass clippings on my driveway, blocking my garage. I need someone here immediately to remove it." There was a pause. "I'm sorry, sir, but did you say Desert View Estates? That's not part of our community." "I know that, which makes it even more insane that you dumped your waste on my property. Let me transfer you to our property manager, Patricia." I waited, listening to hold music that featured a pan flute version of a popular song, which only increased my irritation. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 2 minutes, a new voice came on the line. "This is Patricia Morrison, HOA property manager. I understand there's been some confusion about a waste disposal issue." Her tone was already dismissive, the kind of voice that suggested she was used to dealing with what she considered unreasonable complaints. I could picture her perfectly. Middle-aged, probably with that specific haircut that demanded to speak to managers everywhere, sitting in her air-conditioned office while my driveway was covered in decomposing lawn waste. "There's no confusion. Your crew dumped grass clippings on my driveway, my property, not HOA property. I need it removed now." "Mr. Chen, is it?" I'm looking at our work orders now, and yes, there was a notation that we needed alternative disposal space while our regular composting area undergoes maintenance. The address listed is adjacent to our community. Adjacent doesn't mean you own it. I'm not part of your HOA, I don't pay your fees, and you have absolutely no right to use my property as your dumping ground. Patricia's voice took on that patronizing tone that made my teeth grind. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but there's no need for hostility. This is a temporary situation. The waste will be removed within 5 to 7 business days once our composting facility is operational again." 5 to 7 business days. That's over a week. I can't get my car out of my garage. Perhaps you should have thought about that before purchasing property so close to an established community. There are going to be inconveniences. I'm sure we can come to some arrangement. The arrangement is you remove your garbage from my property today, or I'm calling the police and my attorney. She laughed, actually laughed. "Mr. Chen, let's not be dramatic. It's just grass clippings. They're natural, biodegradable. This hardly constitutes an emergency. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual community members to attend to." She hung up on me. Patricia Morrison, HOA property manager, hung up on me after her crew illegally dumped waste on my property. I stood there, staring at my phone, genuinely shocked at the audacity. I called the Phoenix Police non-emergency line next. An officer told me it was a civil matter and suggested I contact code enforcement. Code enforcement told me they could send an inspector out within 3 to 5 business days to document the violation. Everyone kept saying, "business days," like I was supposed to just accept having my property turned into a landfill for a week or more. I looked at the pile of grass clippings, which seemed to be getting larger and more pungent by the minute. The Arizona sun was beating down, and the smell of decomposing vegetation was already attracting flies. I had a job to get to, software development meetings that I couldn't miss, and my car was trapped in the garage behind this wall of yard waste. That's when I decided to take matters into my own hands, but I needed to think strategically. I wasn't going to let Patricia Morrison and her HOA bully me just because they thought they could. I'd moved to Arizona 3 years ago for work, transferred from the Seattle office of my tech company. I'd saved for years to buy this house, my first real home, and I wasn't about to let some power-hungry HOA manager treat it like a dump. I called my supervisor and explained the situation, taking a personal day. Then I went inside, changed into work clothes, and started researching. I learned that what the HOA had done was illegal dumping, which was indeed a crime in Arizona. But as the police had indicated, enforcement was complicated. I could file a civil suit, but that would take months and cost thousands in legal fees. I needed something more immediate. Then I remembered something the workers had said about the HOA's composting facility undergoing maintenance. I pulled up the Meadowbrook Springs community website on my laptop. Like many HOAs, they had a resident portal showcasing all their amenities. Tennis courts, a fitness center, walking trails, and prominently featured their resort-style community pool. The pool was their pride and joy, according to the website. It had just been renovated last year at a cost of over $200,000, funded by a special assessment on all the homeowners in the community. The photos showed a beautiful infinity-edge pool with a large deck area, complete with upscale loungers, umbrellas, and a poolside cabana. According to the community calendar I could access on their public-facing website, they were hosting their annual Memorial Day pool party that coming weekend, just 4 days away. An idea formed in my mind. It was bold, probably crazy, but I was beyond caring about being the bigger person. Patricia had made it clear the HOA wasn't going to remove the grass clippings anytime soon, treating my property rights as meaningless. If they wanted to dump their waste on my property, perhaps they'd enjoy having it returned to one of theirs. But first, I needed to document everything properly and make one more good-faith attempt to resolve this legally. I called a local attorney whose name I found through an online search, specializing in property disputes. His name was Robert Hernandez, and his paralegal squeezed me in for a phone consultation that afternoon. "Mr. Chen," Robert said when we spoke at 2 that afternoon, "what the HOA has done is clearly illegal trespass and illegal dumping. You have an excellent case for a lawsuit, and I'd be happy to represent you. However, I need to be honest about the timeline. Filing the suit, getting a hearing, obtaining a judgment, it could take 6 months to a year, and that's if everything goes smoothly. What about an emergency injunction? Can't we get a court order forcing them to remove it immediately? We could try. But judges are reluctant to grant emergency relief for property disputes unless there's immediate danger. The HOA's attorney would argue that grass clippings don't constitute an emergency, and frankly, they'd probably be right from a legal standpoint. So I'm just supposed to live with this. No, you have options. You could hire a waste removal service to haul it away yourself, then sue the HOA for the costs plus damages. That would probably be your fastest solution. A company could likely remove it within a day or 2. I thanked him for his time and hung up, then called 3 different waste removal companies. The quotes ranged from $1,500 to $3,000, depending on how quickly I wanted it done, and where they'd need to dispose of it. One company could come out the next morning for $2,500. I sat in my home office looking at my bank account. I could afford it, but the principle infuriated me. Why should I pay thousands of dollars to remove waste that I didn't create? That was dumped illegally on my property by an HOA I wasn't even part of. And even if I sued them later and won, it would cost more in legal fees, take months, and Patricia Morrison would probably just see it as the cost of doing business. No, I wanted her to feel the same violation I felt, the same shock of having your space invaded and disrespected. I wanted the HOA board and all their residents to understand that actions have consequences. I spent the rest of that afternoon planning. I rented a pickup truck from a Home Depot, the largest one they had available. Then I went to a hardware store and bought a dozen large contractor bags, several shovels, and a pair of heavy-duty work gloves. I returned home and waited for darkness. At around 11 that night, when the neighborhood was quiet and most people were asleep, I started loading the grass clippings. It was disgusting work. The clippings had been sitting in the Arizona heat all day, and they'd begun to decompose, creating a slimy, foul-smelling mess. I filled bag after bag, loading them into the pickup truck bed. The pile was so large that I knew I couldn't move all of it in one trip, but I didn't need to. I just needed enough to make a statement. After about 2 hours of work, I'd filled the truck bed completely. I was sweating, covered in grass stains, and probably smelled terrible, but I was also filled with a sense of purpose. I drove the few blocks to Meadowbrook Springs, approaching the community's back service entrance. I'd studied Google Maps earlier and knew that the pool area was accessible from this entrance, which was used by maintenance workers and delivery trucks. The gate was locked, of course, but it was just a simple chain link with a basic padlock, not the sophisticated security of the main entrance. I wasn't about to cut the lock or break in, that would be actual vandalism. Instead, I drove around to the main entrance and did something simpler. I waited. At around 1 in the morning, a car approached from inside the community heading out. The automatic gate swung open, and in the few seconds before it closed, I pulled in behind them. The driver, focused on leaving, didn't even notice. Just like that, I was inside Meadowbrook Springs. I drove slowly through the dark streets, following the signs to the community pool. The area was deserted at this hour, all the expensive houses dark and quiet. The pool was exactly where the map showed it would be, tucked behind the community center building. I pulled the truck right up to the pool deck. The pool area was even nicer in person than in the photos. The renovation had spared no expense. Gleaming tiles, stylish furniture, professional landscaping surrounding the entire area. I could see why the residents were proud of it. It was genuinely beautiful. I started unloading the bags, dumping the grass clippings directly onto the pristine pool deck. Bag after bag, I spread them across the expensive tiles, around the loungers, near the cabana entrance. The smell was even worse in the enclosed pool area. Some of the clippings were so decomposed they were almost liquid, leaving dark stains on the pale deck tiles. When I'd emptied about half the truck, I stopped. This wasn't about destroying their property. It was about returning what was theirs and making a point. I left the empty bags in a neat pile by the pool gate with a handwritten note that I'd prepared earlier. Dear Meadowbrook Springs, HOA, you dumped your grass clippings on my property without permission. I'm simply returning them to your community. Perhaps now you'll understand the importance of respecting property rights. These clippings came from your community and can remain here until you're ready to dispose of them properly, just as you expected me to tolerate them on my driveway. Sincerely, a non-member neighbor. I stood back and surveyed my work. The pool deck was covered in rotting grass clippings. The smell was overwhelming, and there was no way they could use the pool area without a serious cleanup effort. Their Memorial Day party was in 4 days. They had better get started. I drove home, parked the rental truck in my driveway, and went to sleep with a smile on my face for the first time since this whole nightmare started. The phone calls started at 7 in the morning. I ignored the first 3 calls from unknown numbers, but when my phone rang for the 4th time, I answered. Mr. Chen, this is Patricia Morrison from Meadowbrook Springs HOA. Her voice was shaking with fury. What you did is criminal trespass, vandalism, and destruction of property. The police are on their way and you will be arrested. Good morning, Patricia. I assume you found the grass clippings I returned. I thought you said they were just natural and biodegradable, hardly an emergency. You broke into our community and destroyed our pool area. That's completely different, is it though? You trespassed on my property and dumped waste without my permission. I simply returned your property to you. I even left it in bags for easier cleanup, which is more courtesy than you showed me. The police are coming and I'm pressing charges. Please do. I'd be happy to show them the photos of your crew illegally dumping on my property, along with the documentation of my attempts to resolve this matter through proper channels, and your refusal to help. I'm sure they'll be very interested. I could hear her breathing heavily on the other end of the line. You're insane. Do you know how much that pool renovation cost? Those tiles are imported from Italy. Then you probably shouldn't have dumped rotting vegetation on my driveway in 90-degree heat. Strange how much more serious it seems when it's your property being disrespected, isn't it? She made a sound between a scream and a growl and hung up. I got up, made coffee, and waited. Sure enough, about 45 minutes later, there was a knock at my door. 2 Phoenix police officers stood on my porch, looking tired and not particularly thrilled to be there. Marcus Chen. The older officer asked, a woman with graying hair and the weary expression of someone who'd seen everything. That's me. I'm Officer Rodriguez, this is Officer Kim. We received a complaint from the Meadowbrook Springs HOA about property damage and trespassing. They claim you broke into their community pool area and dumped waste on the deck. Is that true? I entered their community through the automatic gate and returned grass clippings that their crew had illegally dumped on my property yesterday morning. Would you like to see the photos and documentation? The officers exchanged glances. Officer Kim, a younger Asian man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, pulled out a notepad. Why don't you walk us through what happened? I invited them in and showed them everything. The photos of the massive pile on my driveway, the time-stamped images, screenshots of my call log showing my attempts to contact the HOA. and the notes from my conversation with Patricia where she'd refused to remove the clippings for 5 to 7 business days. And this property is definitely yours. You're not part of the HOA, Officer Rodriguez asked. Correct. I have the property deed if you need to see it. I'm not a member of their association, never have been. They had no right to dump anything on my property. Officer Kim was looking at the photos on my phone. This is a pretty big pile. It completely blocks your garage. Exactly. I couldn't even get my car out to go to work. I called the police non-emergency line yesterday, but they said it was a civil matter. I called code enforcement, who said they'd send someone out in 3 to 5 days. The HOA refused to help, so I took matters into my own hands and returned their property to them. Officer Rodriguez sighed. Mr. Chen, I understand your frustration, but you can't just enter someone else's property and dump things there, even if they did it to you first. That's not how this works. So what was I supposed to do? Pay thousands of dollars out of my own pocket to remove waste I didn't create? Let them violate my property rights without consequence. You should have filed a formal police report, contacted code enforcement, and possibly sued them in civil court. I did contact everyone I could. No one was willing to help me in any reasonable time frame. Meanwhile, my property is being used as an illegal dump site, and the HOA manager laughed at me when I complained. Officer Kim looked up from his notes. She laughed at you, basically, yes. She told me it wasn't an emergency and that I should have thought about inconveniences before buying property near an established community. Then she hung up on me. The officers looked at each other again, and I could see a silent conversation happening. Finally, Officer Rodriguez spoke. Here's the situation. Technically, both parties have committed offenses here. The HOA illegally dumped on your property, which is trespassing and illegal dumping. You entered their property without authorization and deposited waste there, which is also trespassing and potentially vandalism, depending on whether there's permanent damage. So, what happens now? We're going to file reports for both incidents. The HOA can press charges if they want, but given the circumstances, I'm guessing the prosecutor's office isn't going to be excited about pursuing this. It looks like petty retaliation for their initial violation, but I can't make any promises. Officer Kim added, my advice, both parties should clean up their respective messes and move on. If the HOA continues to dump on your property, call us immediately and we'll document it as an ongoing issue. That gives you much better legal standing. And if they press charges against me? Officer Rodriguez handed me a card. Get a lawyer. But honestly, I think this is going to go nowhere. The HOA created this situation. You shouldn't have done what you did, but I understand why you did it. After the officers left, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety. I didn't want criminal charges, but I also didn't regret what I'd done. The HOA had pushed me to it through their arrogance and disregard for basic property rights. The rest of that day was surreal. I returned the rental truck, came home, and watched as a professional cleanup crew arrived at my house in the early afternoon. They weren't there to remove the grass clippings, though. They were from Meadowbrook Springs, and they very carefully cleaned up the remaining pile on my driveway without saying a word to me. It took them about 3 hours, and when they were done, my driveway looked better than it had before any of this started. I was sitting on my porch, drinking iced tea and watching them work, when a silver Mercedes pulled up and parked on the street. A woman in her late 40s climbed out, wearing expensive athleisure wear and designer sunglasses. Her blonde hair was cut in that specific style, shorter in the back and longer in the front, that I'd mentally associated with Patricia based on our phone conversations. I wasn't wrong, Mr. Chen, I presume? She walked toward me with the confident stride of someone used to being in charge. Patricia Morrison. Yes, we need to talk. I gestured to the empty chair next to me on the porch. By all means, she didn't sit. What you did was unacceptable and illegal. You're lucky we're not pressing charges. The same could be said about what your HOA did to my property. You're lucky I'm not pressing charges. Her jaw clenched. That was a mistake by our landscaping crew. They misunderstood the instructions about where to dump the clippings temporarily. A mistake that you refused to fix when I called you. A mistake you laughed about and told me to live with for over a week. I didn't laugh. I was trying to explain that we had limited options while our facility was under maintenance. I stood up, matching her energy. You know what you could have done? You could have said, "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry, that's completely unacceptable, we'll have it removed immediately." You could have hired the same cleaning crew that's on my driveway right now to come out yesterday. Instead, you were dismissive, rude, and made it clear that you didn't care about my property rights because I'm not one of your HOA members. A flush crept up her neck. I have hundreds of residents to serve. I can't drop everything for every complaint. This wasn't a complaint about someone's lawn being too long or the wrong color mailbox. This was illegal dumping on private property, and I'm not even your resident, which makes your disregard even more outrageous. We stared at each other for a long moment. Finally, Patricia took off her sunglasses and I could see the calculation in her eyes. What do you want? Money? A formal apology? I want you to understand that your actions have consequences. That you can't just do whatever you want to people outside your community because you think you have power. I want you to think twice next time before dismissing someone's legitimate concern. Fine. You've made your point. The pool deck is going to cost us over $10,000 to fully clean and restore. Some of those tiles are stained permanently and will need to be replaced. Are you satisfied? I felt a small twinge of guilt about the tiles, but I pushed it away. Maybe now you understand how I felt watching my property be treated as a dump site. Maybe that $10,000 will remind you to treat people with basic respect, HOA member or not. Patricia put her sunglasses back on. Stay away from our community, Mr. Chen. If you set foot in Meadowbrook Springs again, we will press charges for trespassing, and we won't be lenient. I have no desire to ever enter your community again, as long as you and your crew stay off my property. I think we have an understanding. She walked back to her Mercedes without another word, and I watched her drive away. The cleanup crew finished shortly after, loaded their equipment, and left. My driveway was spotless. It was like the whole thing had never happened, except for the tension still thrumming through my body and the knowledge that I'd made an enemy of the HOA next door. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 3 days later, on Friday afternoon, I received a certified letter from a law firm representing Meadowbrook Springs HOA. Inside was a formal demand for $12,000 in damages for the pool deck cleanup and tile replacement, along with a cease and desist order threatening legal action if I came near their property again. They gave me 10 business days to respond. I immediately called Robert Hernandez, the property attorney I'd consulted earlier. This time, I made an appointment to see him in person. His office was in downtown Phoenix, in one of those modern glass buildings that reflected the desert sun like a mirror. Robert was in his 50s, with salt-and-pepper hair and the kind of calm demeanor that probably served him well in contentious legal battles. We sat in his conference room, and I walked him through everything that had happened since our phone consultation. "So they're demanding $12,000, he said, reviewing the letter. "That's interesting. They're not pursuing criminal charges, just civil damages. Can they do that? Can they sue me when they started this whole thing? They can try. Whether they'll succeed is another matter. Here's the situation, Marcus. Yes, you technically trespassed on their property and left waste there. That's actionable. However, They initiated the conflict by doing the same thing to you first. A good attorney could argue that your actions were a proportional response to their violation, essentially a self-help remedy when legal channels failed you. So what do? We respond with our own demand letter. We document their illegal dumping, your attempts to resolve it through proper channels, their refusal to help, and we demand compensation for your time, stress, and the violation of your property rights. We ask for, let's say, $15,000. Then we suggest that both parties drop their claims and go their separate ways. Will that work? Robert smiled. If they're smart, yes. If they push this to court, it becomes a public spectacle. HOAs generally hate bad publicity. It makes it harder to sell homes in their community when potential buyers Google the name and find news stories about legal disputes. Plus, their case isn't nearly as strong as they think it is. They committed the first violation, and it was egregious. Okay, let's do it. Over the next week, Robert drafted a comprehensive response that laid out my version of events with supporting documentation. He sent it to the HOA's attorneys with a demand for $15,000 in damages and a deadline of 10 business days to respond. Then we waited. The response came faster than expected. 5 days later, Robert called me with news. They want to settle. They'll drop their demand for damages if you drop yours, and both parties sign a mutual non-disparagement agreement. Basically, you agree not to sue each other or talk publicly about this incident. That's it. No admission of wrongdoing on their part, no admission from either side. It's a clean break. You walk away with your record clear, no damages owed, and they can't come after you again for the pool incident. In my professional opinion, it's a good deal. If this goes to court, even if you win, you'll spend months tied up in litigation and probably $10,000 or more in legal fees. I thought about it. Part of me wanted to push forward, to force them to publicly admit they were wrong. But the practical part of me knew Robert was right. I'd already made my point, and Patricia Morrison knew she'd messed with the wrong person. Sometimes the victory was just in standing up for yourself, not in dragging it out forever. Okay. I'll take the settlement. Good choice. I'll draw up the paperwork. The mutual release and non-disparagement agreement was signed 2 weeks later. It was over, legally at least. I paid Robert $3,000 for his services, which seemed like a bargain considering what this could have cost me. Life returned to something resembling normal. I went back to work, focusing on the software project I'd been neglecting during all the drama. I mowed my lawn, maintained my property, and generally tried to forget about the whole mess. But Meadowbrook Springs hadn't forgotten about me. I started noticing little things. The community patrol car would drive slowly past my house several times a day, which seemed excessive since I wasn't even in their community. I'd catch residents staring at me when I was outside, and a few times I heard whispered conversations that stopped when I got close enough to hear actual words. The HOA had apparently told their residents some version of the story, and I'd been painted as the villain. The crazy neighbor who broke into their community and vandalized their beautiful pool. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Patricia had held a special meeting to address security concerns and remind residents to be vigilant about suspicious people in the neighborhood. It was frustrating, but I tried to let it go. I hadn't signed away my right to defend myself if directly asked, only agreed not to proactively disparage them or discuss the incident publicly. So when my neighbor Jerry, an older retired guy who lived 2 houses down, asked me about it over beers one evening, I told him the truth. "Marcus, I've been hearing some wild stories about you and the HOA next door. What really happened?" I gave him the full story, from the illegal dumping to Patricia's dismissive response to my decision to return their grass clippings. Jerry listened, shaking his head in disbelief. "Man, that's insane. And they're telling everyone you just randomly broke in and trashed their pool, apparently. But the legal agreement prevents me from publicly defending myself. I can tell people who ask directly, but I can't post about it online or contact their residents to tell my side. Jerry took a long drink of his beer. That's messed up. Though I have to admit, dumping their grass clippings on the pool deck was pretty brilliant. Petty, but brilliant. It felt necessary at the time. Though I probably should have just paid to have it removed and sued them after. Would have been less dramatic. Less satisfying though, right? I laughed. Definitely less satisfying. About a month after everything settled down, I was working from home when I heard voices in my front yard. I looked out the window and saw two women standing on my lawn, taking photos of my house with their phones. They were both around Patricia's age, well-dressed in that specific way that screamed HOA board member. I went outside. "Can I help you ladies?" They both jumped, clearly not expecting to be confronted. The taller one, a redhead with a severe expression, spoke first. "We're from the Meadowbrook Springs Architectural Review Committee. We've received complaints about your property being an eyesore and wanted to document the violations." I looked around my yard, genuinely confused. I'd just mowed 2 days ago. My house was painted a neutral tan color that matched most of the neighborhood. Everything was neat and well-maintained. "What violations? I'm not part of your HOA." "Your mailbox is the wrong color," the second woman said, pointing to my black mailbox at the curb. "And your house number is mounted incorrectly. Plus, those bushes along your fence are overgrown." "Again, I'm not part of your HOA. You have no authority over my property." The redhead pulled out a folder from her designer handbag. "Actually, according to the county planning documents, your property sits within the architectural control zone established when Meadowbrook Springs was developed. That means certain aesthetic standards apply to all properties in the zone, regardless of HOA membership." I held out my hand. "Let me see that." She hesitated, then handed over a document. I read through it quickly. It was a zoning overlay document from 15 years ago when Meadowbrook Springs was first built. According to the document, properties within 500 feet of the community entrance were subject to certain architectural guidelines to maintain property values. The problem was, those guidelines were vague and had never been enforced on non-HOA properties as far as I knew. This document is from 2010 and references guidelines that don't appear to exist anymore. Do you have the actual current guidelines you're claiming I'm violating? "We'll be sending you a formal notice with all the details," the redhead said, snatching the document back. "You have 30 days to comply or face fines. You can't fine me." "I'm not a member of your HOA. The county can enforce these violations and we'll make sure they do." She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that said she was enjoying this. "Have a nice day, Mr. Chen." They walked back to their car, a white Lexus SUV parked across the street, and drove away. I stood in my yard, anger building in my chest again. This was retaliation, pure and simple. They couldn't let it go, couldn't accept that I'd stood up to them and won. Now they were going to nitpick my property and try to force compliance through some obscure zoning regulation. I went inside and immediately started researching. I found the original zoning overlay document on the county website, along with several amendments and modifications over the years. As I suspected, the architectural guidelines referenced in the original document had been superseded by newer county codes that didn't impose specific aesthetic requirements on non-HOA properties. I documented everything, compiled a file, and sent it all to Robert Hernandez with a note explaining the situation. He called me back the same day. "Marcus, they're harassing you. This is clear retaliation for the pool incident, and it violates the spirit of the settlement agreement even if not the letter of it. So what can I do? Let them send their formal notice. When they do, will respond with a cease and desist letter pointing out that they have no authority over your property, and that their continued harassment could be grounds for a restraining order or a harassment lawsuit. That should get their attention. Will it stop them, though? Robert sighed. Honestly, probably not immediately. HOAs like this, especially when they feel they've been wronged, can be incredibly persistent. But we'll make it expensive and annoying enough for them that they'll eventually decide you're not worth the trouble. The formal notice arrived a week later, listing a dozen supposed violations of my property. My mailbox was the wrong color, my house numbers were too small, my bushes needed trimming, my driveway had oil stains, my fence was the wrong shade of brown, and on and on. Each violation supposedly carried a fine of $50 per day until corrected, which would total over $18,000 after 30 days if I didn't comply. Robert sent his cease and desist letter, along with a detailed legal analysis of why the HOA had no authority over my property. He also included a warning that continued harassment would result in legal action for stalking, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. For a few weeks, things were quiet. I started to hope they'd finally given up. Then the code enforcement inspector showed up. His name was Bill Martinez, a county employee who looked tired and apologetic before he even started talking. "Mr. Chen, I'm here about some complaints filed against your property. I have to do an inspection, it's just procedure." Let me guess, Meadowbrook Springs HOA filed the complaints. He didn't confirm or deny it, but his expression told me I was right. "I just need to walk around your property and document the current state. It won't take long." I let him do his inspection, following him around my yard as he took notes and photos. After about 20 minutes, he handed me a preliminary report. "Honestly, your property looks fine. There's nothing here that violates county code. Your grass is mowed, no junk or debris, structures are sound and properly maintained. I don't see any issues." So the complaints were baseless. I can't comment on the motivations behind the complaints, but I'm not finding any violations. You'll receive a formal letter in a few weeks confirming that. If the same party continues to file frivolous complaints, they could be charged with misuse of county resources. "Can I get that in writing?" Bill smiled slightly. "It'll be in the formal report. And between you and me, if someone is using code enforcement to harass a neighbor, we take that seriously. It wastes our time and taxpayer money." After Bill left, I felt a small sense of victory, but I was also exhausted by the whole situation. It had been almost 3 months since the grass clipping incident, and the HOA was still coming after me. I just wanted to live my life in peace. That evening, I was venting to my girlfriend Sarah over video chat. She lived in Tucson, about 2 hours south, and we'd been doing the long-distance thing for about 6 months. She worked as a journalist for the Arizona Daily Star, and as I told her about the latest harassment from the HOA, I could see her journalist instincts kicking in. "Marcus, this is actually a really interesting story. HOAs abusing their power, harassing non-members, retaliatory enforcement actions. This is exactly the kind of thing people need to know about. I signed a non-disparagement agreement, remember? I can't talk publicly about it. You can't disparage them or proactively tell your story. But if someone were to investigate the HOA independently and discover information through public records requests and interviews with other sources, that's different. And if that investigation led to questions about how they treat non-members and handle property disputes, well, that's just good journalism." I thought about it. "You want to write a story about this?" "I want to look into Meadowbrook Springs HOA. I've actually gotten complaints from readers about them before, but nothing concrete enough to pursue. If there's a pattern of abusive behavior, that's newsworthy. And your situation, even without using your name, illustrates a larger problem with HOA overreach. They'll know it's me. Probably. But they can't do anything about it if you're not the source. I'll file public records requests for code enforcement complaints, litigation records, and HOA meeting minutes. If there are other people they've harassed, I'll find them. Okay, but I can't help you directly. I can't be quoted or named as a source, Sarah grinned. I'm a professional, babe. I know how to protect my sources. Let me dig into this and see what I find. Over the next several weeks, Sarah did exactly what she promised. She filed public records requests with the county and discovered that Meadowbrook Springs HOA had filed over 200 code enforcement complaints in the past 5 years, an unusually high number for a community of only 300 homes. Many of those complaints were against properties adjacent to but not part of the HOA. She also found records of lawsuits. The HOA had been sued by residents and non-residents alike for everything from discriminatory enforcement to harassment to illegal fines. Most cases had been settled with non-disclosure agreements, which explained why there wasn't much public information available. Sarah interviewed several former residents who'd moved out specifically because of the HOA's behavior. She talked to neighbors like Jerry who had witnessed the HOA's aggressive tactics toward non-members. She even got an interview with a former board member who'd resigned in protest over what he called Patricia Morrison's reign of terror. The story ran on a Sunday morning in late August, about 4 months after the original grass clipping incident. The headline read, "Meadowbrook Springs HOA, a pattern of harassment and overreach." Sarah's article detailed multiple instances of the HOA abusing its power, harassing non-members, and creating a culture of fear and compliance through aggressive enforcement of petty rules. My situation was mentioned, though not by name. The article referred to a software developer whose property was used for illegal dumping by the HOA's landscaping crew, then faced months of retaliatory enforcement actions after defending his property rights. It was clear enough that anyone familiar with the situation would know it was me, but vague enough that I hadn't violated my settlement agreement. The reaction was immediate and explosive. The story was picked up by the Phoenix New-Times, then by local TV news stations. Suddenly, Meadowbrook Springs HOA was under scrutiny from media, residents, and county officials. The story resonated because almost everyone had an HOA horror story, and Sarah had documented a particularly egregious example. Patricia Morrison gave a disastrous interview to one of the TV stations, where she came across as defensive and dismissive of residents' concerns. A clip of her saying, "Some people just aren't suited for community living," went viral on local social media, becoming a perfect example of HOA arrogance. The Meadowbrook Springs Board of Directors held an emergency meeting, which residents demanded be open to the public. Over 100 people showed up, including residents, media, and concerned neighbors like me. I sat in the back, watching as Patricia tried to defend the HOA's actions. "We have always operated within the law and according to our governing documents," she insisted, standing at the front of the community center meeting room. "These allegations are exaggerated and taken out of context." A resident stood up, a man in his 60s who looked furious. "You fined my wife $300 because our front door wreath was the wrong shade of red. You called code enforcement on my son's car because you didn't like it parked in my driveway. How is that taken out of context?" Other residents started shouting their own stories. The meeting devolved into chaos, with dozens of people trying to speak at once. Finally, one of the board members, a woman named Helen who looked uncomfortable with the whole situation, called for order. "I think it's clear that we need to review our enforcement policies and management structure," Helen said. "I'm calling for a vote of no confidence in Patricia Morrison as property manager." The room erupted in applause. Patricia's face went red, and she looked like she wanted to argue, but the other board members were nodding. A vote was held right there, and by a margin of 4-1, with only Patricia's closest ally voting against it, she was removed from her position as property manager. Watching it happen, I felt a complex mix of emotions: satisfaction, certainly, vindication, but also a strange kind of sadness. Patricia had brought this on herself through her arrogance and abuse of power, but it was still someone's career imploding in real time. The HOA hired an interim management company while they searched for a new property manager. One of the first actions of the new management was to send formal apology letters to everyone who'd been harassed or unfairly targeted, including me. The letter acknowledged that the grass clipping incident should have been handled differently, that my property rights had been violated, and that the subsequent enforcement actions against me were inappropriate. It wasn't a legal admission of wrongdoing, carefully worded by their attorneys, but it was something. More importantly, the new management instituted policy changes. They created a formal complaint process with appeals procedures. They established clear boundaries for HOA authority, specifically noting that the HOA had no jurisdiction over non-member properties. They committed to working cooperatively with adjacent neighbors rather than treating them as adversaries. Things finally, truly, calmed down. The patrol car stopped driving past my house multiple times a day. Residents stopped staring at me with hostility when I was outside. A few even approached me to apologize for believing the HOA's version of events without hearing my side. Jerry invited me to a neighborhood barbecue that fall, and I was surprised by how many people wanted to thank me for standing up to the HOA. Apparently, I'd become something of a folk hero to those who'd felt bullied by Patricia and the board. "You did what a lot of us wanted to do but were too scared to try," one neighbor told me, a woman in her 40s named Linda. "That pool deck thing was legendary." I laughed, though I still felt a bit uncomfortable with the whole situation. I'm not sure I'd recommend it as a conflict resolution strategy. Maybe not, but it got results. Patricia's gone, the HOA is actually acting reasonable now, and all of us who aren't members feel safer in our own homes. So thank you. Sarah drove up from Tucson that weekend, and we celebrated the resolution of the whole mess with dinner and drinks. "You know this whole thing is going to follow you forever, right?" she said, grinning at me over her wine glass. "You're the guy who dumped grass clippings on the HOA pool deck. That's your legacy now. I can think of worse legacies, at least it's memorable." "It's more than memorable, you actually changed things. That HOA is better now because you refuse to just take their abuse. That matters." She was right. In the months that followed, I heard from other neighbors about positive changes in the HOA. The new property manager, a professional named Michael who'd worked with HOAs for 20 years, brought a culture of customer service rather than authoritarian control. Fines were issued more fairly and only for legitimate violations. The harassment of non-members stopped completely. The community even reached out to surrounding neighbors to establish a good neighbor policy, promising to give advance notice of major landscaping projects, address noise complaints promptly, and generally be considerate of those outside the HOA who still had to live next to the community. It was everything I'd wanted in the first place: basic respect and consideration. It had taken a mountain of grass clippings, legal threats, media exposure, and months of stress to achieve, but we'd gotten there. About a year after the grass clipping incident, I ran into Patricia Morrison at a grocery store in Phoenix. We both froze when we saw each other, standing in the produce section with an awkward tension between us. "Marcus," she said finally, "Patricia, I suppose I owe you an apology. Not for the legal reasons, but because I should have handled things differently from the start." It was the last thing I expected to hear from her. "That's surprisingly gracious." She picked up an avocado, examining it with more attention than it deserved. Losing that position forced me to do some reflection. I got so caught up in the power of it, in being in control, that I forgot the whole point was to serve the community. And I definitely shouldn't have treated non-members like they were less important than residents. For what it's worth, I'm sorry about the pool deck. The grass clippings were one thing, but I heard some of the tiles were permanently damaged. That was excessive. It was also effective. I didn't take you seriously until you made me take you seriously. I should have listened the first time you called. She looked at me directly. I've started working as a consultant now, helping HOAs improve their management practices and community relations. Funny how that worked out. That's actually perfect for you. You understand the pitfalls from personal experience. Exactly. So thank you, I guess, for the life lesson, even if it was delivered in the most dramatic way possible. We talked for a few more minutes, and it was surprisingly pleasant. People can change when they're forced to face the consequences of their actions. Patricia had learned her lesson the hard way, and apparently it had stuck. As I drove home that afternoon, I reflected on the entire journey. A year ago, I'd woken up to find my driveway covered in grass clippings, and had made a choice to fight back rather than accept the injustice. That choice had led to legal battles, media exposure, community upheaval, and ultimately positive change. Would I do it again? Probably not exactly the same way. The mature, rational part of me knew that I should have just paid for the removal and pursued proper legal channels from the start. But the human part of me, the part that valued dignity and fairness and standing up for yourself, didn't regret the pool deck incident at all. Sometimes people and institutions only respond when they face real consequences for their actions. The HOA had felt untouchable, operating with impunity, certain that their power and resources meant they could treat others however they wanted. They needed to learn that wasn't true, and sometimes the lesson has to be delivered in a language they understand. Sarah and I ended up getting engaged that Christmas. She moved to Phoenix, taking a job with a local investigative journalism nonprofit. We bought a house together, and yes, I made absolutely certain it wasn't part of any HOA before we signed the papers. Once was enough for that experience. Jerry retired from his job and started a neighborhood watch program, but the good kind that focused on actual safety rather than nitpicking property violations. He became friends with Michael, the new HOA property manager, and they worked together to create better relationships between Meadowbrook Springs and the surrounding neighborhood. The pool deck at Meadowbrook Springs was fully restored, though I heard some residents wanted to put up a small plaque commemorating the incident as a reminder to always respect your neighbors. That idea was voted down, but the story became part of the community's oral history. New residents were often told about the grass clipping incident as a cautionary tale about HOA overreach. I kept in touch with several of the residents I'd met during the whole ordeal. Linda became a good friend, and she joined the HOA board the following year, running on a platform of continued reform and transparency. She won easily, showing that residents really did want a different kind of community leadership. The story Sarah wrote won a local journalism award for public service reporting. She gave a speech at the awards ceremony about the importance of holding institutions accountable, even small local ones like HOAs. Power imbalances exist at every level of society, she said. Sometimes the most important stories are about ordinary people standing up to the petty tyrants in their own neighborhoods. I was there in the audience, proud of her and also quietly proud of myself for sparking the investigation that led to real change. It's a strange thing to be known for dumping grass clippings on a pool deck, but as legacies go, it could be worse. Looking back now, 2 years after the incident, I can see how it changed me. I'm less willing to accept injustice, more confident in standing up for myself, and more aware of how systems of power operate even at the local level. I learned that sometimes doing the right thing means doing the dramatic thing, that sometimes playing by the rules doesn't work when the other side has already broken them. But I also learned about proportionality, consequences, and the importance of thinking through your actions before you take them. If I could go back, I might have tried a few more legal avenues before resorting to my grass clipping redistribution project. Then again, those legal avenues had a history of going nowhere, and sometimes direct action is the only language bullies understand. The grass clippings are long gone, decomposed into nothing. The pool deck is pristine again. Patricia has moved on to a new career. The HOA operates more fairly, and I live my life in peace, secure in the knowledge that my property rights are respected. Sometimes I drive past Meadowbrook Springs and glance at the pool area, visible from the street. It looks beautiful, well-maintained, the pride of the community. And I smile, remembering that one night when it was covered in rotting vegetation, a monument to the principle that you can't just dump your problems on other people without expecting them to be returned. Life has a way of teaching us lessons through conflict. This was mine. Stand up for yourself, accept the consequences, and don't back down when you know you're right. Also, never underestimate the power of creative problem solving when dealing with an unjust bureaucracy. And if you must engage in petty revenge, make sure it's proportional, makes a clear point, and is satisfying enough to be worth the potential legal headaches. The grass clipping incident became a defining moment in my life, a story I'll probably tell for years to come. It's the time I stood up to an HOA and won, the time I returned their garbage with interest, the time I learned that sometimes you have to fight fire with fire, or in this case, grass with grass. And honestly, knowing that my actions led to positive changes for dozens of families, improved a community's governance, and taught a valuable lesson about respecting others' property rights, I'd say it was worth every moment of stress, every dollar in legal fees, and every grass-stained minute of loading that truck at midnight. Some stories end with grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. Mine ended with a grocery store conversation, a reformed HOA manager, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd made my corner of the world a little bit better. And really, that's the best kind of ending there is.